Let's get started. So I'll just introduce myself and you, and then we'll go through the guidelines of this event, and then we'll get going on the conversation. So my name is Gwen Kruger. My pronouns are he and they, and I am the Director of Customer Experience at Meetup. And today we'll be celebrating Pride Month and just parenting in general with an awesome conversation with author Trystan Reese. Trystan Reese is the author of How We Do Family from Adoption to Transparent Pregnancy, What We Learned About Love and LGBTQ Parenthood. In this episode of Meetup's Dismantling Social Injustice series, you'll discover a refreshing new take on family life for the LGBTQ community and beyond. Trystan will share how he and his partner Biff built a loving marriage and a happy home, learning to parent on the job, using examples of tough moments and touching memories from his own life. He'll show how parenting with love is far more important than getting every single thing right. Amen. Trystan's lessons on parenting are universal and can help parents of all backgrounds through the trials of raising children. And he'll also shed light on his unique story as a pregnant transgendered man. So before we get started, we're going to go over the guidelines and the agenda. This event will, let me just do my little slide. This event is going to be recorded, so you can check it out on our blog in a couple of days. We'll have it linked on there. And not to worry, you will not be on the video as a participant. Trystan and I will be, but you will not be. And we've also gone ahead and muted everybody's audio, so you'll hear us. But if you have a question, you can absolutely submit it through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So just go ahead and click those little two speech bubbles, and you can submit any question, and we'll be going over a few of those questions at the end of this, this chat. And we also have closed captioning available. So on the bottom of your screen, you will see the live transcription icon, and you can select to have the closed captions on. And the agenda today, we'll do a little intro. I kind of sort of did an intro. We'll do a little more intro, and then we'll start chatting, and then we'll do a QA session at the end. Obviously, this is the pitch to become a Meetup organizer and help find others to support the LGBTQ community or any community that you want to find or grow. Use Meetup. You can start a group and save 30% on your first subscription by going to meetupsavings.com. And we'll go ahead and just pitch this at the beginning. We have our CEO has this awesome podcast, lots of great speakers. You can scan this QR code to be taken to a site and link and download the podcast. So without further ado, I am going to stop my share and put us on full screen and intro Trystan Reese. I'm really excited that you're here today. It's an honor to be talking to you. Trystan is an established thought leader, educator, speaker, and founder of the Collaborate Consulting firm, a boutique social justice consulting firm. Trystan has been organizing within the trans community for nearly 2 decades, and he is a 2021 Lambda Literary Fellow. His work has been featured in The Moth, People Magazine, and BuzzFeed. He is married to his partner, Biff, and they live in Portland, Oregon, with their 3 kids, Lucas, Haley, and Leo. They are very happy. So welcome, Trystan.
Thank you. I know I in some days it feels like I aspirationally added that to my bio. It's like, well, I may not be very happy in this moment, but I wish that I was, and I'm trying to be.
You're manifesting.
I am manifesting, yes. And just a little pitch before we get started for the Q&A, super useful for us to know, of the 83 of you who are here, who are members of the LGBTQ community, who want to become parents, we can sort of lean into that. Trans folks specifically, who want to know more about fertility stuff, that's great too. Allies who want to know what you can do in your workplace or how to talk to your kids about LGBTQ issues, any of those things, it's just really useful for us to know where we should sort of lean as we have our discussion. So thanks. And thank you so much for having me, Gwen.
Yes. Awesome. Yeah. And that's great. That's a great frame up of like, this conversation can span all sorts of topics. So let's just start out with like you and like your kind of realization and journey of identifying as a trans man. And can you kind of share about when you first realized that and how your journey kind of started around that identity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I came out as somehow queer when I was around 15. I think for many years I had been adjacent to the queer community and felt like, yeah, that's me. But I knew sort of that I wasn't a lesbian because I did not like girls. And I couldn't be a gay man because I wasn't a man. And so it was, the joke that my mom has is like, if there was a closet, Trystan came out of it. So I came out as bi when I was 15. And then really it wasn't until I was like 19, 20, 21 that I realized that there was a whole word for this thing that I had always known to be true about myself, which was in fact that I was a gay man, even if the rest of the world couldn't see it. And then it was just a really slow process, a lot of stopping and starting. I tried to tell some people in my life. That did not go well. They told me I definitely could not be transgender. I did not look like a man. I didn't act like a man. I wasn't interested in dating women. It was like the year 2002. All right. So we were a little more rudimentary in our understanding of things. You okay, honey? Okay, sorry. I thought that Leo was going to fall out of the bed. And I was like, oh no. But no, he's not sleeping at all. He's just standing up. Okay. Yeah. And so I kind of then ended up going back in the closet. And I got a job and I moved back in with my parents, in my early 20s. And I thought, what if this was just a phase? And I tried to sort of suck it up and just not be trans. But I was really, really, really unhappy. And that was when I realized, okay, I really got to do something. And so I started transitioning right around, whatever age 21, 22, 23-ish. And I transitioned while I was in performing arts school. And so that's a little bit of my story.
Wow, yeah. And then I think you touched upon something that I think is really interesting, is just that there's a difference between gender and sexuality, right? And so being trans, like we get to explore, like our identity is not like boxed into just one thing. Like being a gay man doesn't mean anything about your gender necessarily, right? I mean, it's just there's a lot of different.
It's a different thing. Like who you're into is different than who you are.
Yeah.
And that was really hard for people to understand in 2002. It's a little easier now. It depends on where you are. I've done some work actually with LGBTQ folks in Australia. And even there, like, I got a question from a lesbian woman in Australia that's like, what's the difference again between gay and trans? And so the assumption that everyone knows, it's just not real. Not everyone does. Right. Yeah, so that was harder to explain in 2002, easier to explain now, but there's still some confusion.
Do you think that it's easier to explain now because there's just more there's more terminology that's related to kind of like being able to like put the concept with like a word, or like what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's just the bravery of people who've told their stories. And when we have more than one story to go on, then people can start to understand, oh, okay, there isn't just like one way of doing this. And, like when I told my trans pregnancy story publicly, my biggest fear was that other trans people would come for me and be like, you're making it harder to be trans, you're confusing people. But what happened was the opposite. In fact, lots of older trans guys were like, I would never do that. And it's so cool that you're doing it. Like, it's so cool that people can see there's lots of ways to be a trans guy. You don't have to be just pretend like or act like or really embody everything about non-trans men. You can kind of pick and choose between both in a way that makes sense for you. So mostly people have been like, that's great. And so I just think it's that we have more possibility models now than we had before. The language piece, I think, is pretty confusing, actually.
Yeah.
The fact that we have more words, I think, is more confusing for non-trans people.
Right. Yeah. And because it's like, oh my God, I have to look up, like I've heard like non-binary and demi boy and like all of the different
asexual. Yep. And not to say that it's great. Those are super useful for us inside the community.
Right.
And really useful for non-LGBTQ people who are further along in their journey. But we have to understand that is college level stuff. And most of the people that I talk to and work with are at like elementary school level.
Absolutely. And that's fine, right? Like we want people to learn and to ask questions and to feel comfortable asking questions, right? Yeah. So, you mentioned your experience as being a trans man who's pregnant. And so would love to kind of get into that. Like, what was that like? That's a pretty general question, but maybe you could share that. share that. Maybe, you know, what it was like, what your experience was, and how you kind of made that decision.
Yeah, I mean, there's really two major decisions. One is like to decide to grow our family by carrying a child myself. The other was to tell our story publicly. And the first one, you know, it's as complicated as anything else. We had two adopted kids and wanted to grow our family. We did not want to go through the process of adoption again. It had been a very traumatic experience for us and for the kids. No regrets, would do it again in a heartbeat, probably a little bit differently, but would do it again in a heartbeat. Do you want me to get the peanut butter open for you? Okay, yeah, bring it to me. But it took everything we had, emotionally and financially. Like it took everything we had. And so it can seem strange to a non-trans person, but actually like the easiest, cheapest, most straightforward way for us to grow our family was just for me to have a baby. That was like literally it. And so, yeah, he's been up here. He's okay. And so it took a while, but I convinced my partner that we should do that. And so that was kind of like the first hurdle. And we very much agreed in the beginning that we're going to do this quietly, that no one except for our very close friends and family will know that I'm pregnant. And really until the baby's born, we just won't mention it to anyone. And even then, you know, our hope was we could just say like, welcome the newest member of our family, and then that would be it. And if people wanted to message us privately and ask, we would say like, oh yeah, Trystan, Carrie, whatever. But just a little while into my pregnancy, I felt that it would be really important. You know, we talked a little bit about people who've been able to tell their stories publicly. We just thought that it would be important for more people to see that there are options available to them that they maybe didn't know were available. And for non-trans people to see that, like, again, there's lots of ways to be trans. Like I get to be a man and have a baby. Why not? You know, yeah. And so those were the sort of two major things: is deciding to tell our story, and then before that, like actually deciding to get pregnant. And that was sort of part of our thought process along the way.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. Like what you talk about with like visibility is it's such a like the decision to really like take the pregnancy out of your personal sort of family life, and you know, be like, it's a risk to be visible as a pregnant man in the world. Like you're opening yourself up and your family up to a lot of criticism and judgment and whatever. I'm sure that you received it. But the visibility, I mean, what was your kind of mental calculus or moral calculus on like, it's more important to be visible than to protect ourselves from this?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was really a faulty process in retrospect. I am old enough to remember, you know, I mean, obviously, as far as we know, transgender men have been giving birth for at least 21 years, maybe longer. But as far as I know, the oldest kid of a trans person I know, he's turning 21 this year, Blake. But I'm old enough to remember the first public story that was told. And, you know, at the time I'd been organizing in the trans community for several years. I like some of my areas of expertise are messaging and storytelling on trans issues specifically. And like, I knew at that time, 10 years ago, this is not the right time. People are not ready. And the backlash against that story was really horrific. And so part of the calculus for me was believing that the world had evolved and was in a different place and was ready for this kind of story. Another part of the calculus was really about what does it mean to be white, you know, non-trans presenting, like people wouldn't see me on the street and be like, that's a transgender person, not visibly trans is a different way to put it. I live in Portland, Oregon, and it really felt like it was irresponsible to keep us in this place where transgender women, especially transgender women of color, had to bear the burden of doing all the education, storytelling, cultural change, all of that. And they've been doing it for so long with relatively little help or support, with such integrity and grace, that was part of the calculus. Is like, yeah, there may be backlash against me in the family, but my hope was that like my comfort meant that other people were bearing the burden of discomfort. And if I could take some of it on more sort of democratically,
Right.
Reallocate that discomfort,
Right.
that would take the burden off of other trans people, especially trans women of color. And I just was not prepared just was not prepared for the level of backlash that I ended up getting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like you said, like the burden is real, but it is, many hands make light work. And I think that that's a big, consideration as folks with privilege in the trans, like white, being white in the trans community, like we have to, there's a responsibility to be a part of that change and to really step up because we do have that privilege. And yeah, and the fight is real, and so the more people that can really participate in it and really help people understand and see and create pockets of the country like Portland, Oregon, where it's like safe to be a pregnant trans man. I mean, that's it's really important. What would you most like to share with our audience that they might not realize about being a trans man who's pregnant?
I mean, there's lots of misconceptions, so like I do a lot of work training, medical providers and support people. One of the most common misconceptions, I mean, there's a lot of them, but one of the common misconceptions is that if you are trans and you get pregnant, you'll like hate being pregnant. And in fact, the data shows that just as like for anyone that gets pregnant, there's a huge variety of approaches and experiences of being pregnant. Some people get pregnant and love it, right? They're like, oh, this is dope. And the way that looks for trans people can be, and the data shows that about 1/3 of all pregnant trans people have this experience, can be like, oh, I may have felt ambivalent or even negatively about my body and its uniquenesses before, but now that it's being used to like grow a person or like nourish a baby or build a family, like that's awesome. And people actually end up really liking the experience, right? And so I get DMs on Instagram of trans people who are like, oh no, I'm really enjoying being pregnant. Does that mean I'm not really trans? And I have to say, no, not at all. Like about 1/3 of the trans people who get pregnant have that experience. About 1/3 find that their relationship with their body gets neither worse nor better. That was me. I was just kind of like, I don't know, I have a body, it does cool stuff, it doesn't do other things. That's kind of what it was growing a human, being pregnant. I was just like, well, this is cool and weird. Like that's pretty much the whole pregnancy. Right. And then some people do find that the pregnancy does trigger what we call dysphoria, like that deep and profound feeling of discomfort with one's body and how it relates to one's gender, or one's body and how the world views it and how it relates to one's gender. So that's like one thing to note, is like there's no one experience of trans people getting pregnant. Some love it, some hate it, some are ambivalent. Right. None of that means that they're not going to be or will be a good parent. None of that means that they are not really or are really trans. Like there's just no correlation. It's just like everybody else. Some people love being pregnant, some people hate it. Yeah, that's how it goes. So that I think is one thing that I want to make sure people know, is like, some people might like it, some people might not. Some people might have really good experiences with providers, some people won't. There's just as much variety there as there is anywhere else. Yeah, and that's really interesting, because just for myself, like when my wife and I made the decision to have a child together, we did reciprocal IVF. And this was before I started to transition, but it was even like going through the process of, so reciprocal IVF, for those in the audience who don't know what that is, basically I had an egg retrieval done, and then we used donor sperm to create embryos, and then the embryos were implanted in my wife's uterus. And so she carried our son through gestation. Your bun, her oven. Exactly. Exactly. So that's the shorthand, TLDR. So that was the decision. Really was, for us, was like, I had no interest in being pregnant whatsoever. Like I just didn't want to do it, and kind of knew, like, I'm kind of complaining and don't like, summer or whatever. Like I was just like, I don't want to do it. And she was like, you know what? I don't want to deal with you doing it. So like I'll carry. And she loved being pregnant up until the 3rd trimester, and she hated it. But it really worked out well. But yeah, I could see, like, it's just different for everybody. And I know trans guys who've carried, and I know, like, it's just, it's kind of incredible. So yeah, everybody's different. I know, I love the reciprocal IVF stuff, just because it is a way that both people, if there's 2 people in a partnership, that both people can have a connection to a pregnancy. And I have 2 adopted kids. I have 1 biological child. There's nothing magical about having a biological connection to a child. There's never a time when you're like, oh, like I love my kid, but I love them more if like they had my dimple.
Right.
This just doesn't happen, you know, but some people still want to have a biological connection. So I think that's a really cool way of doing it, is like, get your eggs out, your partner carries it. I know quite a few trans folks who've been able to do that. And I'm just like, it's just really cool what we're able to do now.
Yeah, it is. And there's so many ways to do this. It's kind of incredible.
And that's really the advice I give to LGBTQ people. You know, sometimes they put me on these panels, you know, that's like parenting for LGBTQ people or something. There's always some like young, like bright-eyed LGBTQ person who's like, what advice do you have for people who want to become parents? And like, my advice is always wait.
Right.
And then everyone laughs and I'm like, it's not a joke.
Yes.
Wait. So like, that's the first thing I say is like, you're never too old to become a parent, but you are definitely, there are times when you are too young.
Yeah.
And then the other advice is always just like hold tightly to your vision of becoming a family and whatever that means for you, but hold lightly to how you get there. Because like, what if they hadn't been able to get your eggs?
Right.
You know, what if your partner hadn't been able to sustain a pregnancy and you had to use a surrogate, or you did have to like whine your way through 9 months, but that's how you could become a family. Like, nature's messy, science is messy. Sometimes the world has other plans for us.
Yeah, there's no guarantees.
That's right. So we kind of have to be open to the messiness, and then that just gets us ready for the actual act of parenting.
Absolutely. Yeah, because parenting is that's pretty messy, right? Literally and figuratively.
That's right.
So speaking of that, you mentioned adoption, and your parent to became a parent to a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old pretty immediately. It sounds like there's a journey there. Can you share a little bit about that, as you're comfortable with, and just like what that, what takeaways you want folks to know about that process and that experience?
Yeah, about a year into my relationship with my partner, we got a phone call that my partner's sister wasn't going to be able to take care of her kids, and they needed a safe place to stay. And that social worker told us that the kids were probably going to have to go into foster care, would likely be separated, and that the likelihood that my partner's sister would be able to get them back to do what she needed to do to prove to the social services and to the court that she could get to the place where she would be able to provide them a safe and supportive housing, living family scenario, the chances of that happening were pretty low. And so the social worker said, this is pretty much your opportunity to keep them in the extended family, if that's something that you guys can do. And so we said yes. And so really from almost overnight, like we got the phone call on Friday that she was coming to take them on Monday. And at that point we called my partner's sister and said, do you want them to come and stay with us for a little while, give you a little bit of a break, get your life together? And she was like, sure. So literally overnight, then, the next morning, Saturday morning, we went and picked them up, and they were 1 and 3. And then they never left, and they still won't leave. I'm just kidding. They're 10 and 13 now. And so they have a high level of resilience around.
And they understand sarcasm.
They understand it too well. Too well. Yeah. And, I don't know if I have any lessons learned from that process. I mean, I wrote a whole book about it, I guess, or like half the book is about that. Other than just like, I do not recommend becoming a parent overnight to 2 very traumatized toddlers.
Yeah. I mean, 2 just not traumatized toddlers would be difficult, but I would imagine
1.
Yeah.
1.
Mm-hmm.
1 traumatized or non-traumatized toddler would be a lot. But
Right.
I don't recommend that way. Again, no regrets. But if you have a chance to do it differently, like that's what I recommend.
Yeah, that's pretty intense. That's like right into it. I know that I've heard you kind of speak about sleep. Like, this is always on my mind, is parenting, because the number one obstacle for me was the lack of sleep, like immediate lack of sleep. I didn't really anticipate it, although people talk about it. Any advice around like sleep and parenting?
I know, it's so annoying. That's the first thing that everyone asks when you're like out walking the baby's like, oh, are you getting any sleep? No, of course I'm not getting any sleep.
Right.
Like, they need to eat constantly. They're pooping all the time. They cry. You don't know why they're crying. But for us, it really was about really as equitably as possible, not equally, but equitably divvying up the responsibilities. And so like, it's been like for the first at least 6 weeks after I had been pregnant, grown a whole person in my torso, and then squeezed them out of my body. Like for the first 6 weeks, my partner did the overnight shift. I got to sleep. Like that's what I needed. I needed to sleep. I needed to heal. There's like a list of like 85 things they don't tell you can happen during pregnancy. One of them happened to me, which was I had rib separation, which meant that the fetus was too big for my literal body, which all my doula friends said is not possible. False, it is possible. Your body can grow a baby that's too big for it, and mine did. And so my ribs were splintering from my sternum and were separating from my spine in the back.
Wow.
So it was gross and hurt
Yeah.
real bad.
Yeah.
I needed to heal. Like that's an intense thing to heal from. Any pregnancy labor is intense to heal from. And so that's like how we did it, is we just decided what was most equitable given how much I had put into the pregnancy itself was for Biff to just like do the night shift for the first 6 weeks so I could sleep and heal. And that was great. That was really good for my mental health. It was really good for me to not feel like the reason that I was so tired was because of this baby that needed me all the time. You know, none of those sort of resentments built up. And so that was really, really helpful. And then we did have people volunteer to come and do overnight so Biff could get a night's sleep, you know? Yeah, so I think just like leaning on our community, accepting that like whatever's going on right now is just for right now. Prioritizing our relationship, you know, still finding ways, the two of us, to connect outside of the baby and outside of the big kids. Yeah, that's kind of it. You just kind of deal with it. And then for us, like we never did co-sleeping. We wanted him to be used to sleeping in his own space. As soon as it was safe, he goes into his own room in a crib, so that we always had our time together, and that being a parent didn't bleed into being a couple.
Yeah.
Because we feel like if we're not good, the family's not good, you know?
Yeah.
And so that was something that we always prioritized. And I don't know if that's the right thing. It just ended up being what was right for us.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. Like it's different for every couple and every family unit. Like some family, I remember we had the same thing where our son was like in our room every night for a while, and we had to make a decision whether we wanted to just kind of like have that be our thing or not. And I was like, no, like I don't, you know, we talked it through. We were like, no, we need to go back to sleep training. And that was the decision we made. And then there are other parents who are totally fine with that. And that's okay. You know, like it's up to the couple and the family and the parents and whatnot.
And the kid, like every kid wants different things, the same as every human wants different things.
Right.
So,
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned something too, you said equitable, not equal. So can you kind of unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when the big kids first came to live with us, you know, we thought everything had to be equal. That meant that like, okay, I do bedtime, you know, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and one weekend. And then my partner does bedtime like Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday on the weekend. And I do the dishes for breakfast, and then my partner does the dishes for dinner. Like we thought it had to be equal.
Right.
And then we soon realized that's stupid because we're each good at some things and not good at others. We each hate some things more than the other does. Like I don't function well if I haven't gotten sleep, right? Okay. So then Biff started doing the overnights, but I do really well. I get like a second burst of energy in the evening and Biff is done, right? So that means that like I always did at like post-dinner cleanup, stories, bath time, toothbrushing, story time, tuck-in songs, that kind of thing, because Biff is done. Okay.
Yeah.
So like Biff does overnight, I do evening. Like you do what like each person can lean into their strengths and what they happen to be good at, or which they just hate the least, instead of becoming obsessed with like your turn, my turn, your turn, my turn. And that ended up working out really well for us. And also because I'm the working parent, I'm really vigilant about not just deferring all household duties to Biff, because Biff happens to be the frontline parent. I don't want to be that guy who like comes home from work, puts his feet up on the coffee table and demands a beer. Like, I don't want to do that. So like I pretty regularly will check in with Biff, like, what can I do to be helpful? I can take out the trash or do the dishes. Which would you prefer? Like I try to make a very specific offer of help. So I'm not putting more labor on Biff to tell him to like actually think through what's most useful. So I try to say like this or that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like the concept of playing to strengths is, probably more enjoyable for the kids too, because nobody's really doing something that they just like don't want to be doing.
Right. The kids want all the silly voices, and like that is my forte. I do silly voices.
There you go. So
they don't even want Biff reading because they're like, this is boring.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah. They don't want to listen to NPR. They want action.
They also don't want me having not slept as much as I need. They don't want me grumpy all day the next day.
Yeah.
They don't, trust me. So yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And I love that. I love that advice. So kind of flexing into talking more about sort of being trans. We're gonna go into more trans instead of parenting stuff.
Yeah.
Many of the recent anti-trans legislative proposals specifically stigmatize and alienate transgender youth. So as a parent and a professional consultant with a focus on social justice, how do you talk to your kids about that, about trans rights and just what's happening in the world, and in our country and in the different states, with some of this legislation that's, really kind of oppressive and hurtful and harmful?
Well, that's like two different questions. One is like, how do we think about, this renewed interest in stigmatizing and vilifying trans youth, and that's a little different than like, how do we talk to our kids about being trans? And so I think one of the important things to know is the context for all of this anti-trans legislation. Like the year in the summer of the year that the Supreme Court decided that gay marriage was legal nationwide, by November of that year, anti-LGBTQ forces were running anti-trans ads on television. Like we're talking about within 3 months of having lost the marriage fight, they invested in fighting against trans people, right? This is like a very direct and specific lineage of bigotry and political attacks. And first they tried bathrooms. Trans people shouldn't be allowed to go in the bathroom, blah, blah, blah. They lost in every state except one. And then that state, North Carolina, ended up overturning it because they got so much backlash from the business community, right? So they were like, okay, fine, the bathrooms thing isn't really gonna work. What else can we try? And so they've been trying for the last 4 years. Where can we get a foothold? And then they were trying a little bit before that as well. But really, this has been happening. And I think about it a little bit like whack-a-mole. We hit them on bathrooms, something else pops up. We hit them there, something else pops up. And so this is just the newest thing. Whether it's, should doctors be able to deny services to trans people because of their religious beliefs? Should trans youth be able to play on sports teams? 33 states are trying to make it illegal for kids as young as kindergarten to play on teams that they're actually most aligned with. Not a single one of those states has a single trans athlete that they can point to say, this person's the problem, right? It's a boogeyman, right? So whether it's schools or trans youth, they're just grasping at straws. And they're gonna continue to do it. Doesn't mean we don't fight it. We do. And I just wanna make sure that people don't say like, oh, this is like a brand new thing. No. This is just like the newest iteration. It's just like the anti-marriage fight in a new form. And so that's a little bit separate from like, how do we talk to kids about trans issues, which is the same way we talk to them about anything else. Developmentally appropriate, conversational. Sometimes, you can bring it proactively, whether you like have some great kids books that have some trans characters or whether they ask you questions, right? Both proactively and reactively, and in language that they can understand. So like, with my 3-year-old, it is like, most boys have this kind of body. Some boys have a body like mine that can have babies. Isn't that cool? And he's like, yeah, that's awesome. That's it. And then as they get older, then it's like, and some people think it's wrong to have a different kind of body if you're a boy. Can you believe that? And they're like, oh, that's terrible. What? Same way we talk about race and racism. It's like, some people think that it's that this, our color skin is better than other. Can you believe that? And Leo, he'll always be like, but that's not true. And I'm like, you're right. It's not true. Isn't it silly? Why would people think that? And if someone says something like that to them, what should we say instead? Right? The same thing, just like easy, conversational, little steps along the way. When they say something that's not in alignment with your values, you don't shame them, but you just say, I want to ask you a question about that thing you just said about all girls having long hair or whatever. Why, why do you think that's true? And who do we know that that doesn't apply to? No shame, just like loving, gentle, conversational, to sort of bring them along. And literally before you know it, they're going to be correcting you on your language, as my 10-year-old does often.
I'm sure they know, like, they're more up to date on what's going on.
Oh,
Yeah. So one of the things that I really love about like your story and just like hearing you in different interviews and reading about you is just like how you focus on joy and affirmation. I think that like so many times, in history, like queer stories are told from this place of like, tragedy, like, or like, like a very sad tale. And like, there's just so much joy and affirmation in your family's story and in your journey. For any trans folks who want to have a family but might think like, oh, I can't do that, or I'm not, like this just doesn't seem possible where I live, or there's just too much stigma. Like, what would you say? What do you have? What message do you have for them?
Well, just to speak a little bit to your first comment about the like tragedy stories versus the joy stories, it's really important for people to understand. It just depends on who the audience is. So like for people who are like vehemently anti-trans, right? Who are polarized, who like don't understand it, who vilify being trans, those tragedy stories are actually a really, really important tool to help them distance themselves from that negative opinion they might have of trans people. So like actually pity is a really powerful tool for change, right? It's not the only, but for those people who are in that rudimentary place when they're like, oh, I don't get trans stuff, or I think that's weird or whatever, but I'm not like that, right? I'm not like that dude, that like really awful guy on Fox News. I don't think that those things are true. Is that what I sound like? Or like, oh my gosh, trans people are being killed in the street and there's no justice for them at all. That's awful. If we can get them there, it feels icky to be like, oh, feel bad for us. I'm sorry, but like it is an important way of reaching people who are in that place.
Right.
But like my story's not for them. I dealt with those people for like 9 years. That was my full-time job, was talking to those people who are in that rudimentary stage. I'm just like, I don't want to do that anymore. That's not fun for me anymore. I did it, it's done. Now I'm like, for the people who are like, okay, I get it, there are barriers, they need to be motivated to be part of the change. And the message that's going to motivate them is that joy, resilience, power. Oh, I don't feel bad for these people anymore. These people are dope. Like, I really believe in what they're doing. Like, I see the commonalities in our stories and our struggles and the very real important differences. And like, I want to relate in around our commonalities, and I want to be in solidarity around our differences. Like, how do I do that? And that's who my story is for. Nice. So it's not that the tragedy stories shouldn't exist, they should, but they're for a certain person,
right?
And if you're the person who's like, why are there more of these? Great, it's not for you. Just the same as my story isn't for everyone either, right? There are a lot of people who are like, yeah, okay, joy, happiness, great. Okay, what do I do with all this anger? That's somebody else's story. That's somebody else's message to pick up.
Right.
So that's sort of where I am. And a lot of trans folks need to be pulled out of their own polarizing thing. I see someone in the Q&A is already asking, like, what do I do with this shame? And like, that's what my story's for. Because to me, the opposite of shame is pride. That's why we have Pride Month. It is to replace the feeling like there's something inherently bad about me, and replacing with like, no, like, you are brilliant, you are sacred. Like, we are connected to this sacred lineage of queerness that stretches throughout all of time and space. I don't know about space, but at least throughout all of time, across all cultures. I don't know.
Universe.
Oh, that's right. That's probably too spiritually, but I don't know.
I like to go there.
Yeah. And so again, lots of queer folks, they've already done that work. They're like, Tristan's story is boring. Who cares? A man who had a baby, lots of men had babies. Totally. My story's not for you.
Right.
But for the trans people, like the person in the chat, who are like, what do I do with this shame? Like, that's what I hope my story conveys. And that's what I try to encourage people to see is like, stop doom scrolling. Don't look at the tragedy stories. They're not for you.
Right.
Go to the joy. you know, go to the celebration, go to the pride, don't look at the comments and see people doing all this other stuff. That's your work, is to get back to like, you are a dope and magical person and the world is blessed to have you. And we need you.
Yeah, that's a really, you know, I've never really looked at it that way, as like, we can filter out, like, let's optimize, like, there's a lot of information flowing to us through social media and the news and the doom, and we could doom scroll all day and get some really gnarly, detrimental messaging reinforced, or we can kind of filter it and curate and like look to the light. Let's go where it's warm, you know?
Yeah.
And that's a powerful tool.
Yeah, I mean, I just heard someone say like, your social media feed is your vision board. Like, if you're someone who like wants to cut out like, what is my dream for like my best self, and put it up somewhere, like, social media is your vision board. Those are all the messages that are seeping in consciously and subconsciously to your brain and reinforcing positive or negative stories you have about yourself and the world.
Yeah.
So like, you get to choose, like, what do I want to be reflected back? Is it the stories of like pride, resilience, power, or is it stories of shame, hatred, blah, 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 et cetera, blah, blah, blah. And again, it's just about where you are in your life and where you want to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really great. So let's get into some of the questions. So I'm gonna go to Nikki, a Brit living in France and working in Switzerland. I have a 9-year-old trans son who started his transition almost a year ago. I'm learning to navigate a world where the LGBT community isn't very prevalent in a language I don't speak well. Turns out there is more support out there than I ever imagined. I am at the start of a learning journey. I'm grateful to hear other people's stories and any advice on how to be a super mom to my amazing, brave little boy. Thank you for sharing and inviting us. So what, any advice for Nikki?
Just get out of the way. That's it. That's the same advice I have for any parents, especially of trans or gender or creative kids, is, you know, just think of yourself as like the guardrails on the freeway. And like, they can kind of wander back and forth, but you just keep them from hurting themselves or other people. And that's kind of it. So if they say, oh, my name is this today, okay. I turn on this, okay. So like, don't go out there and join PFLAG and put out a rainbow flag. Like, don't go overboard, right? You don't want to influence them in any way. Just like, sure, okay, what do you need? All right. And do you want me to correct other people or no? You know, just ask them, do you want me to correct other people? Do you want me to tell your teacher or no? I'm comfortable doing it, but it's up to you, you know? And so that's all I say. And then just let them figure it out for themselves.
Yeah, it's a very like loose garment, sort of like, I'm here for you.
Yeah, that's right.
Alex shares, I am a transgender man since 12 years ago, no T, no surgery, and I may or may not choose to bear kids in the future. What are your greatest fears before adopting / getting pregnant, and were they as bad as you had thought originally?
Yeah, I guess I just don't do much from a fear place, which is not great for me. I should have better systems in place for protecting myself. And so really what I should have been worried about the adoption was just how incredibly emotionally difficult it would be for me to be in situations where I have zero power. Like, I think we had 12 court dates at least in total over the course of 3 years. Wow. So that's like me in front of a judge. All of them were like old white men. They're up literally above you physically. 10 to 20 to 30 years older than me, looking down in the robe, looking at me and my queer ass partner being like, does this look like a family to me? Right. That was horrible. Strangers coming into our house, looking at the paintings on the walls to determine whether or not we like are good enough to be a family. Yeah. Interviewing my boss, interviewing my doctor. Should we like, is this a family? Are they good enough to be a family? That was so disempowering and traumatic that I was not prepared for at all. So it was mostly things that I did not fear or prepare for that ended up being awful. And I'm also a bit of a whiner like you, Gwen. And so it was like, ugh, I don't know, like, can I really do pregnancy? And it was way worse than I thought. Way worse. I really thought like, no, I'm going to suck it up. I'm going to keep working full time. I could not do that. I could not do that.
Yeah.
Couldn't do it. And this is another place where the equitable thing comes in. Like I was getting so mad at my partner for not like taking care of me. And finally we sat down and Biff was like, yeah, I'm not good at that. Like, I'm not good at babying people. Like, here's what we should do. Like, you are good at taking care of yourself. You do that. And like, I am good at like running the household. Let me do that. So like, I'll step up in terms of housework, childcare, etc. You step up in terms of like taking better care of yourself. Like, don't work so much. You shouldn't be taking the bus to and from work every single day. Work from home.
Right.
Take a bath, sleep in, have a nap. And so, yeah, I had to deal with those things.
Play to those strengths. You know, it's funny you mentioned that patriarchal system of like judgment that has to go down in like just any, you know, in adoption cases or child welfare cases. And even like with me and my wife, like for our son, we have to do second parent adoption, even though I am biologically his parent. My wife gestated him. We actually have to adopt. I have to adopt my son. And in some states, until recently, in some states, you had to actually have a social worker come in and observe,
interview you,
which is it's just bonkers. That thankfully we don't have to do that. I live in New Jersey, and we don't have to do that in New Jersey any longer. To have the social worker come in, we still have to adopt. So it's I mean, you don't have to, but there are many reasons to do it.
It's a good idea too. I mean, I spent 2.5 years traveling the country supporting LGBTQ folks building families. And I really try to empower everyone to do it in the way that feels right for them. And I like always have to be the negative Nancy who's like, you should probably do the second parent adoption just in case.
Just in case.
Yeah.
Which is like, oh, just in case what? You know, like that's, my wife and I have had a lot of conversations about that for sure. All right, let's go back to Q&A. So Christina asks, I have several friends with kids who identify as trans or are exploring that idea. Do you think there is an age that is quote unquote too young? Some of my friends worry about that. I don't know how to support them other than to listen and be positive.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a few things is, you know, what we do know quite a few like cold hard facts, science data about transgender people when they are young and into adolescence. So one is we know that giving people social support is life-saving, right? So we know you cannot bully a kid out of being trans. No kid has ever been bullied out of being trans. You can bully a kid into hating themselves. You can bully a kid into wanting to be dead. You cannot bully them out of being trans. Similarly, you cannot support someone into being trans. Right? I don't know of any cases of adults who are like, oh, I'm really mad at my parents for letting me explore my gender when I was 5, 6, 7, 8. In fact, most people look back and they're like, oh, even though I didn't end up transitioning and living as a trans adult, I really appreciate that I was allowed to just be myself and figure stuff out for myself. That's really what we see. What we also see is that not just social supports, but into adolescence and late adolescence, medical supports are life-saving for trans people and completely reversible. But it really isn't until you're like 16, 17, 18, if even then, that you're allowed to do anything irreversible. And so what I tell people is, listen, it's the bar for getting any kind of medical supports for trans youth is actually really high. You have to be showing a gender identity that's insistent, consistent, and persistent. So your child has to be insisting in every realm of their life that they are trans, that they are this other gender. It has to be consistent across all realms of their life, not just when they're playing with this one friend, but at school, at home, in play, in the morning, in the evening, and it has to be persistent. It has to have persisted for several years. So this right-wing talking point that like we're giving sex changes to like none of that is real. None of that is real. Yeah, sure. Maybe we're telling parents if your kid wants to cut their hair when they're 5 and go by Tommy instead of Thomasina, sure, okay. Let them do that. We know that does not cause harm, and we know it can be life-saving if they actually are trans.
Right.
And so that's, you know, those are some of the things. Feel free to just like take whatever you want from that buffet that might be useful.
It's awesome. Great. Charlie asks, hi, I'm non-binary. Hi, Charlie. And have young nibblings. The oldest is 5. and nibbling is a non-binary or term for, I think nieces and nephews is what the gendered version would be, right? Yeah.
For
Or is
sibling.
it sibling? It's sibling. Is that right? Okay, thanks. Thanks for that. Is that old enough to explain my gender? The oldest is 5. Is that old enough to explain my gender? I don't know if their parents use my correct pronouns or have tried to explain it, so I'm not sure how to start.
Yeah. Well, you know, I really would focus on what is most safe for you and then what you like want emotionally. And so what I want to make sure is that you are able to have a conversation with, if, you know, if this is like, I mean, nibbling really could be like a niece or nephew, right? It's a gender neutral term for younger relatives. And so I really would check in with like, who is their parents and just say like, hey, at age 5, you know, I think that Sally, whatever, might be ready for me to talk a little bit about my gender stuff. I want to do that in a way that feels right for you. You know, how would you prefer I go about it? Check in with them, because what you don't want is for a relative to get mad at you because you said something that they deem to be inappropriate, right? This is not about what's globally inappropriate. Of course not. I talk to my kids at all ages about trans stuff. They're fine. Everything's fine. But I would really defer to what is safe for you. Talk to their parents first and say like, hey, I'd like to introduce this. You know, I want to make sure I'm doing this in collaboration with you all. How are you talking about it, etc. And if they're like, yeah, I don't know, I don't care. Okay, then you can start to have that conversation. And if they ask, are you a boy or a girl? You can say, well, I'm neither. I'm something else. And, you know, I'm something else. I'm something that's different. Isn't that cool? Like, do you know anybody else who's like that? And again, just trying to frame it as positive as possible. And they may, 5 is at really a developmental stage when kids are especially in that like black or white, either or. So they may say like, no, you have to be one or the other. Okay, that's like how their brains work right now. That's fine. And so you can just say like, oh, I know that's true for a lot of people, but I'm different.
Right.
And if you have any questions about that, you can always ask me or you can ask your parents. You know, just be ready that at age 5, they may say, no, you have to be one or the other. And you can just say like, yeah, I can totally see why you would believe that. Most of the world operates that way. I'm just a little bit different.
Right. Yeah, that's great advice. And I similarly, like, just my son, like, he's, you know, known me as Baba. I was using they, them pronouns for a long, like, since, you know, he can probably remembers language, and just started using he, they fairly recently. And he has always just referred to me as a person. And it's been kind of amazing to see how quickly he's adopted that. He didn't have to adopt it, actually. It's not even, he didn't adopt it, he's raised with it. So that's all he's known. It's almost like he has to adopt the binary. Because he wasn't raised with it. So it's kind of interesting.
Yep. I have a trans friend who just adopted a little one who can't say dada, which was what they were trying, but instead says yaba. And they were like, actually, we're going to keep that. That's like a great gender neutral parent thing that the kid just came up with at whatever, like 10 months old. You know, it's just like, that's so sweet. So kids figure out their own stuff.
Yeah, and they'll like name you. They'll give you a parent name if you're open to it. They'll give it to you for sure.
Well.
All right, last question, and then we gotta go. So let's see. Yvonne asks, "Hi, I am a parent of a daughter transitioning to a male who is married to a gay man. They have a 2-year-old. What are some resources for all of us, the couple, the transitioning individual, and me, the mom, nona, and mother-in-law?"
Yeah, the 2-year-olds transitioning. So I would recommend, at least for the parents, I would recommend the website that I built, transfertility.co. We have a whole video library of interviews with people in different types of situations. So like, I gave birth to a child and I'm transitioning now. My spouse is transitioning. We had kids after transition, before transition. I'm a solo parent. I'm a polycule. Like, all different kinds of stories is what we've been trying to do there. And so that's what I would recommend. And thanks, Gwen, for putting that in the chat, that link. And then we're at Transfertility on social media as well, on Instagram and Facebook. So that's a really good resource for them, just to like watch more stories and connect to more people who are like them. And I think it's also useful for you as well to watch some of those videos or to read some articles, just to have a sense of what they might be going through. And then I think just, asking questions out of openness, not assuming, and using that as a starting point, so you can say, I watched a video and this person said that they really struggle with that. What's your experience been with that? And, if they're open to it, and they may not be early on in your transition, it's a little bit more of an internal process. You may not be open to larger conversations. But sometimes my mom will come to me with those questions. So, I never asked you about X. What was that like for you? And what do you need from me around it? And so I think just opening that door, having that conversation, asking questions, knowing a little bit, reading a little bit can be really helpful in that regard.
Certainly. And like, definitely like also just like finding communities, like Meetup is a great platform for just finding communities that are open to, inviting, folks into the conversation and just helping to kind of learn and dialogue around like safe space, creating safe spaces to have those conversations where people can ask questions, where it's like, all right, this is open, ask me anything. And obviously staying respectful. I think like that's also really important to like make sure that like even if a trans person opens up and says like, you can ask me anything, like making sure that that's a respectful space both ways. Cool. Well, Trystan, this has been incredible conversation. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience and your strength and your hope and your insights with us. Before we go, I'm gonna one more time just share my screen and share the QR for the podcast and the go back one, the savings, Meetup savings.com, 30% off a group if you want to start an organizer subscription and create community. And then I'll go back to this. This is David Siegel's podcast. And yeah, we are going to continue our series of talking about dismantling social injustice. This is a great conversation. And we will definitely make sure we post this link on our blog. So thank you so much again for joining us. And be safe, be well, and have a great summer.
Thank you, everyone, so much for being with us.
Bye.